Thank you, Dave. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, President Samuelson and Brother Wheatley and fellow members of the BYU community, and welcome to the students who have come from afar. I really can't pass by this moment. I think everybody in this room and at the dinner we just attended felt the energy in the young people who are here. We're absolutely thrilled and filled with anticipation. I had the chance to visit a couple of universities, meet some of you, and at Georgetown and Pepperdine, and I shouldn't mention any universities because I'll forget the others, University of San Diego. It is humbling to be with you here and to think you've come this far for this opportunity. And again, welcome. Dr. Eboo Patel has asked me to make this an informal introduction, so I'll just read from the bottom instead of the top, okay? And if you call him Dr. Patel, he says it makes him feel old, but he's pushing 40 and he should get used to that. So that's about as informal as I can get. Dr. Patel and his wife, Shinaz Mansouri, have 2 sons. He holds a doctorate in the sociology of religion from Oxford University, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar. He is president and founder of Interfaith Youth Corps, a Chicago-based organization that has built the interfaith movement on college campuses. He's written a couple of books that I would recommend to you: Acts of Faith, The Story of an American Muslim, The Struggle for the Soul of a Generation, and Sacred Ground, Pluralism, Prejudice, and the Promise of America. He's done a great deal in his career. Let me just mention we had a wonderful conversation with him earlier today. And I guess my take on Dr. Patel is that he's somebody who asks sincere questions. And I think in a setting like this, there is almost no more encouraging and positive and frankly beautiful thing than to see a young person with a sincere question in their mind, sincerely seeking an answer. We've come to study the question of how religion can help bridge gaps, and you're about to hear from somebody who has thought an awful lot about that question, has gone to the best minds and to some of the best hearts that this world has to offer. We're really looking forward to hearing from you, Dr. Patel, and we welcome you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you. I'm looking at the person who offered the invocation. Where is he? I just want to thank you for praying for me, for my expression. I will need that. For their understanding. Depending on the quality of my expression, they will need that. So, thank you for praying for thanking God for the great weather. I left a city that was 60 degrees colder than this. I am heading to, of all places, Green Bay, Wisconsin on Thursday, where it will be 75 degrees colder than this. I did the ultimate wussy thing as I called today and I said, "Are we canceling the event on Thursday?" They're like, "In Green Bay, we don't cancel stuff unless it's negative 40. So I think I'm going to be in Green Bay on Thursday. Anyway, pray for me there, please. 7 or 8 years ago, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright wrote a book called The Mighty and the Almighty. And the big notion of the book is something that visiting fellow and keynoter tomorrow, Doug Johnston, has been advancing for about 25 years, was that religion matters in world affairs. The thing that struck me the most about that book was she says somewhere around page 70 that when she was Secretary of State, she had literally armies of people that she could turn to when it came to non-proliferation issues or economic issues. But there were barely a handful of people that she could turn to within the State Department or diplomatic circles in the United States who were experts on religion or religious diversity. Right? She had one of the best in the world in Doug Johnston, but there weren't that many, and there aren't that many Doug Johnstons. Here's why that struck me. Because Secretary of State Albright wasn't calling for more programs or more money or even new bureaus. She was saying, I need people. I need leaders. If there is a central part of my talk tonight, it is going to be on what it means to be an interfaith leader, the identity category interfaith leader. Let me say a few words about the power of an identity category. One of the identity categories that I kind of came of age with was the category social entrepreneur. Anybody heard that? Okay. So it didn't exist 25 years ago, or it was barely coming into parlance. Right? Bill Drayton in 1983 articulates the term social entrepreneur and says that the social entrepreneur is the animal who sees creative things in the civic or social world and builds reality to those ideas, changes patterns in the civic or social world. So Jane Addams was a social entrepreneur. Florence Nightingale was a social entrepreneur. These are the Bill Gateses and Steve Jobs of the social and civic world. When I first read that, it was in the work of David Bornstein, and a friend of his is in the audience. He's the editor of the Deseret News. I thought to myself, my gosh, that's what I am. I got no gift for making money, but I look at the social and civic worlds and I think to myself, well, if we did this a little bit differently, if we tweak that, this kind of institution is missing. And that term, that identity category, social entrepreneur, gave me a name to call myself. I have to tell you, the first conversation didn't go over that great with my dad. I was like, Dad, I finally know what I'm going to be, a social entrepreneur. My dad was like, Plan A was Yale Law School. We're sticking with Plan A. No. But without that identity category, first of all, I had nothing to call myself, whether or not the term is impressive. I had no network to build. But once you start to use the term social entrepreneur, other people start to come around, communities start to form. You start to build a knowledge base. You start to create a literature. You start to articulate a skill set. And it finally occurred to me, things that we take for granted right now, the term environmentalist, at one point it didn't exist. So that doesn't mean that people didn't care about the earth, didn't think that it was precious and needed to be protected. It's just that they had nothing to call themselves. They had that energy running through their bones and their blood, but they had no community, they had no knowledge base, they had no literature, there's no ability to articulate a skill set. Human rights activists, same thing, right? People have long believed in their hearts that every human being has dignity and that governments at the very least cannot violate that dignity and actually ought to defend and protect it. But until the term was articulated, human rights activist, no opportunity to form a community, to build a knowledge base, to articulate a skill set. Think of anything that you care about, conservationist, civil rights worker. At some point, somebody gave it a name, gave flesh to those bones. I want to do that tonight for interfaith leader, and I want to define it thus. An interfaith leader is somebody with the framework, knowledge base, and skill set to build understanding and cooperation between people who orient around religion differently. You see, I went to grad school, right? A sentence-long paragraph. I'm going to say it again. An interfaith leader is somebody who has the framework, knowledge base, and skill set to build understanding and cooperation between those who orient around religion differently. We can have a whole set of geeky conversations about what I mean by that mouthful, those who orient around religion differently. Suffice it to say for now that it means everything from Muslims and Jews to internal divisions within Islam, like Sufis and Salafis, to believers and non-believers, to the various political orientations within the Catholic, Lutheran, evangelical, whatever community. In other words, it means the variety of ways that people orient around religion, politically, socially, theologically, etc. Why does this matter now? I want to cite a modernity theorist named Peter Berger, who is at Boston University. He says, we live in the late modern age, in the late 20th and early 21st century. And he says, the signal characteristic of the late modern age is interaction between people who are different. The world has always been diverse. It has never been this interactional. What that means is that 500 years ago, there were Muslims and Jews and Christians and various stripes of Christians, etc., etc. But those people weren't bumping into each other all the time. the creation of world cities, the advent of air travel, communications technology, migration flows, means that in the smallest town in America, if you tap somebody on the shoulder in the town square and say, tell me about a Muslim, they might never have met a Muslim, but chances are very high that they've heard stories, probably mediated through communications technology, and they'll give you a pretty good description of what they know from those stories. Now, this means all sorts of things. First of all, it means that it means that we moderns live a very complex psychological life. If the only people you meet are ones like you never have to ask yourself the question, why do I do what I do? If your whole world goes to church on Sunday, well, that's just what happens on Sundays. But as soon as a Muslim kid moves in, or a Jewish kid moves in, or an atheist kid moves in, and goes to Jummah on Fridays, or to services on Saturday mornings, or doesn't go to church at all of a sudden, at least implicitly, you're asking yourself the question, well, if she doesn't go to church on Sunday, that means it's possible to not go to church on Sunday, which means, why do I go to church on Sundays? We are constantly justifying our lives to ourselves all the time in the modern world. The second big question, of course, is how do you relate to people who are different from you? So after you go through the psychological process of why do I go to church on Sundays, the next question is, how do I deal with or treat the kid who doesn't go to church on Sundays? Our entire lives, Berger says, are defined by this set of processes. This is what characterizes the era in which we live. So all of you grew up in an era in which you heard things like diversity is our strength, diversity enriches us, we ought to celebrate diversity, etc. How many of you, I mean, like since like second grade, this is what you grew up with, right? So I'm taking a sip of water before saying this. Baghdad is diverse. It's true. It's also a civil war. Belfast is diverse. It's also a barely cooled conflict. Bombay is diverse. On a good day, things are okay. On a bad day, there's a bomb somewhere in that city, largely between groups who orient around religion differently. Diversity is not necessarily a good thing. In many parts of the world, it's not a very good thing at all. Harvard scholar Diana Eck articulates this well when she says, look, diversity is simply a fact. It's a demographic reality. It's neither good nor bad. It is simply the fact of people people with different identities living in close quarters with each other, interacting with each other. The question is, what do we do with that diversity? Diversity can just as easily become a civil war as it can become something beautiful and positive, the kind of thing that your elementary school wanted you to think it was. What do we do with diversity? So here is a challenging reality that the sociologist at Harvard, Robert Putnam, discovered when he ran a set of empirical studies on diversity. He found that diversity and social capital were actually inversely correlated. What does that mean? That's fancy grad school speak for, in diverse cities, there's actually less trust. People report lower rates of volunteerism, lower rates of voting. Diversity left to itself often creates what Putnam calls a hunkering down effect, people feeling more isolated. The challenge there also is that it leaves a vacuum for extremist and divisive forces to begin playing in that terrain, hence Baghdad. What do we do with diversity to turn it into something positive? This is what Diana Eck calls pluralism. Our definition for pluralism at Interfaith Youth Corps has 3 parts. Pluralism is a situation where people's identities are respected, there are relationships between diverse communities, and there's a commitment to the common good. Here's another way of defining an interfaith leader. An interfaith leader can take religious diversity and build from it religious pluralism. Let me emphasize again. Religious diversity can just as easily, if not more easily, turn into a conflict situation than a situation of pluralism. Let me encourage you to do an exercise. For the next week, read the international section of the New York Times, page A1 to A8. Cut out the stories that have something to do with religion. Put them in two piles, the ones that have to do with religion and conflict and the ones that have to do with religion and something else. Then see how much of the international section you have left and see which pile is higher. And ask yourself the question, what is religious diversity most likely to lead to? And then ask yourself the question about the urgency of interfaith leadership. Frankly, interaction between people who orient around religion differently can turn into four things. It can turn into bubbles of isolation, harder and harder to continue in the modern world, to be a bubble of isolation. It can turn into barriers of division where people emphasize their differences and divides with other people. It can turn into bombs of destruction. Those are the extremist movements that you will see when you do your exercise in the New York Times. Or four, it can turn into bridges of cooperation. But here's the crazy obvious thing. Bridges don't fall from the sky, and they don't rise from the ground. People build them. You build them. Madeleine Albright, circa 1996, was looking for people in the State Department as she was dealing with the Balkans, as she was dealing with Northern Ireland, as she was dealing with the Middle East, as she was dealing with South Asia, which came this close to a nuclear conflagration in the late 1990s. Averted, thank God, by the Clinton administration at the time. She was looking for people who could deal with situations of religious diversity and make of them religious pluralism. This is, without a doubt, one of the great challenges of the 21st century. I want to put this into two quick categories. One is, let's call them emerged states or emerged democracies. I lived in Europe for 3.5 years. Half the story in European domestic social politics was around religious diversity, largely the presence of a Muslim population. Even in emerged and established states like the United States, where I would say half of our domestic issues have significant religious implications, and there are significant religious actors on multiple sides. How you deal with religious diversity in emerged and established democracies is a major issue. For the most part, blood doesn't flow in the streets as a result of these issues. We negotiate them through the political process. We hold protests, which are guaranteed by free speech. We elect candidates. We support nonprofit organizations that advocate for the causes we believe in. We take cases to the Supreme Court. But these are still some of the great issues of our time in these states. And in emerging democracies, Egypt, Afghanistan, Iraq, these are life and death issues to the tune of 50, 60, 70 people a day dying because of them. Here's the issue in Afghanistan, Egypt, and Iraq, amongst other states. People looking at those who orient around religion differently from them, Ikhwanis and secular Muslims in Egypt, Tajiki Muslims and Pashtun Muslims in Afghanistan, Sunnis and Shias and Kurds in Iraq, and they say, I will not share a society with you. I refuse to let the people you elect govern me. I'll kill you instead. Anybody in this room who plans to have a career in an international aid organization or in the State Department world, in any sort of world of defense, diplomacy, or development, better be able to deal with those issues, because I don't see them going away until the end of this century. So what does it take to be an interfaith leader? What's the framework, the knowledge base, and the skill set? I just want to say a couple of things about this tonight. Things that are frankly informed by being here at Brigham Young University, a university that I have wanted to get to for very personal reasons, which I'll share a little bit later, for really over 20 years. So the first thing that I want to say about this is that I think it's important to have what I call a theology of interfaith cooperation. I'll tell you something. Religious extremists have a theology. They can quote you chapter and verse why they have a gun to the head of somebody they think is praying the wrong way. Those of us who believe in a world in which religious divides are bridged and are committing ourselves to build those bridges ought to be able to articulate our own theology or ethic if you are a secular humanist and don't want to use the term theology, which I think is perfectly fine. Some of the best interfaith leaders I know are secular humanists. The ability to articulate that theology. In other words, you are saying to your fellow Christians or Muslims or Jews, I am an interfaith leader, not in spite of being LDS, but because I am LDS. It is encoded in the DNA of the tradition. What is your theology of interfaith cooperation? 10 years into this, when you realize, as the Buddhist poet Gary Snyder said, that the most you can hope for is to move the world a millionth of an inch, and as smart as you are, and as beautiful as you are, and as talented as you are, stuff's just not moving that much faster than a millionth of an inch. Every once in a while, I have to tell a really talented college graduate that when Bob Dylan sang, "The whole world's gonna be different when I paint my masterpiece," it was irony. You have to think that what you're doing has its effects now, God willing, in the long term, but also that it's holy, that it's sacred, that it's deep in your bones, that it's how the universe or God or whatever your cosmology might be wants it to be, the work you ought to do. So what is your theology of interfaith cooperation? I started to ask myself this question. I went back in the Muslim sources and scriptures, and I found this story. So we Muslims believe that in the year 610, a merchant named Muhammad, who was known in the city of Mecca as Al-Amin, the reliable, the trustworthy, made his annual pilgrimage to a cave on Mount Hira in the month of Ramadan. And on one of the last odd nights of the final 10 days of that month, as he was praying and giving alms to the poor and fasting, as was his practice for many years by that time, Muhammad was visited by an angel, Angel Gabriel, and he felt this force squeeze him. And the first thing that the force says is, "Ikra," recite. And Muhammad says, "I'm not a reciter." And the second time the force squeezes him and says, "Recite." And Muhammad for the second time says, "I am not a reciter." And the third time, Muhammad feels like the life is being squeezed out of him. And finally he finds coming from his mouth the words, "Recite in the name of your Lord who created humankind from a clot of blood." The first verse of the Quran. And there are traditions that say, the Quran, by the way, means recitation. It's from Ikra, recite. There are traditions that say that Muhammad was petrified. He thought that he had been possessed by a demon. He thought that he had jinn, is what it's called. He'd become a kahin, one of the jinn-possessed poets of the Arabian Peninsula. He thought that this meant that he had forsaken his belief in the one God, the God of Abraham. He went to the person he trusted and loved most in the world, his wife. For me, that's a powerful example of the exalted role of women in Islam. And his wife, Khadija, hears the story and says to her husband, "I don't know what's happened to you, but I know that God has not forsaken you because you are too good and righteous and believing of a man for that to happen. I know somebody who can shed light on this. My uncle Waraka is a man learned in the scriptures. I will go to him and tell him this story." So Khadija goes to her uncle Waraka, sits before this man dressed in robes. Waraka listens, nods his head, and says, "Verily, the prophet of your people has arrived." And the next time that he sees Muhammad passing through the square in Mecca in front of the Kaaba, he comes to him and looks him in the eye because he wants some of the nur of God, and he kisses him on the forehead and says, "You are the beginner of a new religious civilization." So who was Waraka? Who was the first person to recognize the prophethood of Muhammad? What does it mean to be learned in the scriptures in the early 7th century in the western half of the Arabian Peninsula? Waraka was a Christian. The first person to recognize the prophethood of Muhammad, the coming of a new religious civilization, was a Christian. A man who, incidentally, never converts to Islam. That's the beginnings of my theology of interfaith cooperation. I want to be clear about something. This is not proof texting. This is identifying a deep logic in a tradition that says to you, I am commanded, I am inspired, I am meant to be an interfaith leader. This is who I am and what I do. I think oftentimes those moments for people come in a powerful personal moment. I'm geeky enough for it to come in part from a grad school moment, late at night with Muslim sources. It also comes in deep personal moments. I think of one in particular, 1950, late winter, early spring, young man, college age, 20, 21, from deeply devout Baptist family in Atlanta, Georgia, prince of the black church. Daddy was a minister, granddaddy was a minister, great-granddaddy was a minister. He's now at seminary up north, and he goes to hear a sermon from the great black intellectual Mordecai Johnson on Christian love. Johnson is the president of Howard University. He's recently been to India. And I keep on thinking to myself, what must have been going through young Martin Luther King Jr.'s mind, sitting in the back of that lecture hall, when he hears Mordecai Johnson give as the embodiment of Christian love in that lecture the example of a Hindu from India, Mahatma Gandhi. That's King's first interfaith moment. Recognizing that somehow Hinduism has created in Gandhi a Christ-like paragon of nonviolence. Something that frankly rocks King's world. Up until that point, King writes that he'd only seen the Jesus ethic of nonviolence as something that was relevant for personal relationships, not something that you could run as a policy of a state, not something that was useful in international affairs, certainly not something one can consider doing in a social movement. But that night, at Fellowship House in Philadelphia, the young student King begins to wonder to himself, what can I, as a future Christian preacher, learn from the example of a Hindu from India? And I have this image of him, bracket Crozer Theological Seminary, a stack of Christian books on his left, the Bible and Tillich and Niebuhr and Rauschenbusch, and on his right, a stack of books, biographies of Gandhi. And he's going back and forth between those, asking himself, what does it mean to be a Christian in the light of the knowledge of what Hinduism taught Gandhi about nonviolence? Everybody knows what happens in 1955. Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on that bus in Montgomery. A set of senior black leaders approach Martin Luther King Jr., 26 years old at the time, and say to him that they want him to be president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. And King thinks in the back of his mind, we're going to go Gandhi on this town. And for the next 380 days, King leads the African Americans of Montgomery in a stunning set of peaceful marches and boycotts. By the way that this history is taught in high school is Rosa Parks' feet was tired, then Martin Luther King gave a couple of sermons, and then we elected Obama. Right? 380 days. I want you to think about walking to work for 380 days. Right? One of the nights when King was preaching in a church, his friend Abernathy, he could see that there was something wrong, and he calls him over and he says, Ralph, what's going on? And Abernathy says, your home has been firebombed. And King says, are Coretta and Yuki, the baby, okay? And Abernathy says, we don't know. So they drive King to his home, and he doesn't know if he's going to see his wife's corpse on the floor. That was the Montgomery bus boycott. And when it was over, and a journalist asked King, honestly, Dr. King, think about what a great sacrifice you had to endure for a small victory. I mean, you get to sit front to back on the buses of one provincial city in the American South. Aren't you angry? Don't you seek revenge? And King, through that reading of Gandhi and the different kind of Christian he had become, says, this isn't the time for revenge. This is the time for reconciliation. This is the time for redemption. This is the time to build the beloved community. Martin Luther King Jr. was many things. He was, I think, the greatest American of the 20th century. He was a civil rights hero. He was an African-American hero. He was a paragon of nonviolence. But amongst all of those things, King was also an interfaith leader. In 1959, he preaches from his pulpit, Palm Sunday. "O God, our gracious Heavenly Father, we call you this name. We know some call you Allah. We know some call you Brahma. We know some call you Elohim. We know some call you the unmoved mover." That's the second to last line in that Palm Sunday sermon in 1959. The last line, "We open the doors of the church for those who would come to the front and accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior." Martin Luther King Jr., deeply appreciating the religious traditions of other people, lifting up the holy names that other people call God, and knowing exactly who he is as a Baptist Christian. That's what an interfaith leader is. Somebody with roots and wings. Somebody with a theology or ethic of interfaith cooperation that says, I am a Muslim, and it is precisely because I am a Muslim, or a Mormon, or a Jew, or a secular humanist, that I build bridges between people who orient around religion differently. I want to tell two more stories. Here is the other thing we do with diversity. We pretend that diversity means interesting ethnic restaurants. What diversity really means is disagreements on fundamental matters, especially religious diversity, right? Religion, Paistilic, is about ultimate concerns, fundamental things. Diversity is not about colorful people who all agree with you. Diversity is about profound disagreements. So if you are dealing with religious diversity and you encounter somebody who you disagree with on a massive issue like abortion or gay marriage or where to draw the line in the Middle East, and you look aghast and you say, I can't believe you see that differently, you're in the wrong business. You can't have water without the wet. If you walk into a room and everybody there is eating interesting ethnic foods and is of a variety of colors and they all agree with you, it's an interesting space, it's not a diverse space. Dealing with religious diversity means being able to deal with people who disagree with you on fundamental matters. And how else do you have a diverse democracy unless people who disagree on fundamental matters are able also to work together on other things? And how else does that happen unless you have a vanguard of leaders who are creating spaces, who are articulating a language, who are deploying a knowledge base, who are applying a skill set, who say, listen, you're going to disagree on doctrinal matters. You're going to disagree on some social matters. But the reason that malaria deaths have fallen significantly over the last 10 years is because a set of interfaith leaders, especially in Africa, decided to work together to distribute anti-malarial bed nets. And tell me that that is not also a holy project. So the African imams and the Christian preachers who disagree on heaven and disagree on matters of government agree on matters of making sure that 3-year-olds don't die from mosquito bites, which is why they work together on that malaria campaign. And it takes a set of leaders to bring those folks into a room, to recognize that they already have disagreements, but to focus their attention on areas in which they can work together. Again, how else do you have a diverse democracy unless people are willing to do that, unless you have leaders creating space for them to see those possibilities? So here's my favorite story about this. So one of my heroes and mentors is a woman named Ruth Messenger. For those of you who were at the Interfaith Youth Corps Leadership Institute in Los Angeles a couple weeks ago, you heard this story. So Ruth was the Manhattan Borough President for many years in New York, ran against Giuliani for mayor, found next vocation leading the American Jewish World Service, and was encouraging to Interfaith Youth Corps from the beginning. By the way, The people you will never forget are the ones who believed in your crazy dreams when you were 19. And that's what Ruth Messenger was for me. So somebody at Interfaith Youth Corps once asked her, how did you start off as an interfaith leader? What got you into this? And Ruth tells this story that her first job after graduating from grad school happened to be for the state government in western Oklahoma, working for the foster care division. And her job was to find foster families, especially for orphans from Native American backgrounds. Now imagine, here is a Jewish New Yorker working outside the home, working for the state government, graduate school educated, western Oklahoma. Right? Just start imagining the differences and disagreements present in that situation. And the group of people that Ruth found who were most ready to immediately provide foster families for these kids who were languishing in orphanages were Southern Baptists in western Oklahoma. I'm like, so did you go to church a lot, like every Sunday? She's like, uh-huh. And also Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Because these folks had church all the time. Right? She's like, backyard praise gatherings, front porch prayer circles, Sunday morning wood frame churches. I was there. And I think to myself, how many millions of disagreements must Ruth Messenger and those folks, especially the people in the pulpit, must have had? Early, mid-1960s, youth revolutions all over the place, revolutions that were not particularly looked upon kindly by those folks. And Ruth Messenger and those preachers recognized their disagreements and decided to focus their energies on working together to provide foster families. I imagine that sitting in the back of those prayer gatherings and song circles and wood frame churches on Sundays, Ruth heard a lot of things that probably offended her. Welcome to the disagreements around religious diversity. And she kept her focus straight as an interfaith leader. And how many thousands of kids have foster families as a result of Ruth and those Baptist preachers in western Oklahoma deciding that they were going to build bridges instead of bubbles or barriers? That's interfaith leadership. Recognizing there's a wide swath of things in which you disagree, deciding to have the discipline to focus on areas of work together. So here's my final story. It's a personal one. And I think that ultimately people come to this work out of some kind of a personal story. Maybe you've experienced religious discrimination. You saw a friend experience it, and you're just like, look, I just don't want that to happen to anybody else. Maybe like Martin Luther King Jr., you have found somebody from a different religion that you admire deeply, whose way of being Buddhist or Hindu or Mormon has changed your way of being Jewish or Muslim. So here's my story. So when I was a junior in high school, I fell in love with a Mormon girl. And somehow God was working with me, and he encouraged my expressiveness. I don't know how well God did that tonight, but did a good enough job of it when I was a junior in high school to convince one Lee Spence to begin to date me. And maybe a week into our relationship, Lee sat me down and she drew a stick figure of herself. And she drew a circle around about 85% of her body. And she said, everything that's in the circle is no-go. I was a 17-year-old male, caught up in, the various biological and cultural processes of the time. And I looked at that circle. I looked at Lee. First thing I thought was like, is there any wiggle room here? Is it a dotted line? It was not a dotted line. And it was my first experience of somebody willfully following a discipline based on a cosmic order. And it was amongst the best things that has happened to me to fall deeply in love at 15 and to be able to prosecute that love through dimensions other than the ones I might have chosen at that time. And the first time that I thought to myself that a cosmic order is what I wanted to be a part of. And discipline is something that I wanted in my bones. And that it didn't actually originally come from me. It came from elsewhere. And I wanted to align with elsewhere. And it is because of Lee Spence, a Mormon girl that I met when I was 17, that I recommitted to Islam when I was 23. And I don't think I'd be a Muslim or an interfaith leader without her. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Patel. As Dr. Williams indicated, we'd like to have a question and answer session. We have plenty of time and would like to ask, if you would, to take advantage of the mic over here. Please also go ahead and identify yourself for us and also for the recorded part of the program. We'd in particular invite the students in the audience to take advantage of this opportunity, and we know it'll be as edifying as what we've heard so far. So please, and if you'll just manage it from there.
Sure.
Okay.
Great. Who's got a question?
Hi. Thank you very much. Bill McDonald, Arizona State. I was wondering what your thoughts are on the situation in Egypt, and specifically how you feel that the relationship between Islamist elements in the country and elements desiring secular governance are going to develop, and whether or not those Islamist elements, because of the immense backlash that they faced after Morsi's deposition, are going to become, in the future, more radicalized.
I mean, you're going to hear me say this a lot. I don't know. Right? I just don't know. But I'm gonna keep emphasizing my theme, right? Which is that this was not true. So the United States is a remarkable country for many reasons. One of the key reasons is because at our birth, our founders believed you could have a nation with people from a range of communities, right? And if you read Michael Walzer's beautiful little book, which I would commend to all of you, What It Means to Be an American, one of the things that Walzer says is that for generations, centuries really, political philosophers had believed that the only way to have a democracy was in a homogenous nation. You had to be of one race, one religion, etc. Because political philosophers thought that people from another religion would never accept an elected official or a government elected by the other people, right? And he ends that section, Walzer does, and he begins the next one, and it starts with, except in the United States of America. We're the first democracy to believe, the first nation to believe you could have democracy and diversity at the same time. That is now table stakes around the world, right? Because of what Peter Berger says, the situation of modernity, there are no homogeneous societies anymore. Even a place like Saudi Arabia has very interesting internal diversity, right? So as those places become democracies, which is to say, as various segments of the population can organize civically and politically, part of what happens is one group of people says, I won't be governed by you. And I think that this is going to be one of the great challenges in emerging democracies, which is how do you have communities who think they right now think they can't be governed by the other, right, live in the same state together. And I actually think the United States has done a reasonably good job of this, right, that the huge fights we have in which religion is implicated, abortion, prayer in schools, gay marriage, etc., these are heated as they ought to be, and they're largely negotiated through political, judicial, and civic processes. I think that That is the only way this can go. Otherwise, you're going to have, the Egypts and the Syrias and the Iraqs and the Afghanistan break up into 25 different little states. Unless people are able to live in a diverse democracy, which is to say, live with people that they disagree with. How we get from here to there, I have no idea.
Thank you.
That's, by the way, I think that's why they're hosting this conference. I mean, you all got to figure this out. You think I'm joking? I'm not joking.
Hi, I'm Jessica Drevis. I go to BYU. I just transferred here from New York University after having gone to a Catholic high school and an Episcopalian elementary school, and the whole time I was LDS. And in my experience, I found that my peers who were in my generation were the ones who were not only more concerned with, but I guess more amenable to positive interfaith relations. And it was those in positions of power or influence who tended to hunker down, as you put it, and adopt a more combative approach to other religions. Do you think that there's some sort of generational impact upon interfaith relations? And if so, why is it that we're seeing more of a focus in younger groups than in the leadership who probably are maybe in a better position to push interfaith relations?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. So, by the way, I mean, if you're 19, the power that you have now is maybe higher than any 19-year-olds in the history of the world, right? And the reason I say that is because of how technology changes every 3 years, literally new generations of technology, and you guys are natives to that, right? I mean, Bill Gates built Microsoft when he was 25. Mark Zuckerberg invents Facebook when he's 19, right? The Twitter folks are in their 20s and 30s. This is not an accident, right? What I'm saying is that the means of production, so to speak, are no longer the steam engine in which you need millions of dollars to buy one. They're now the iPhone. And the things that you're able to do are remarkable. So yes, you might not move budgets in the same way as other folks do, but as far as cultural patterns go, there's a bunch of people in the front row here who are like, I feel like they think that the 22-year-olds in Silicon Valley are driving the world, right? And they feel they're not part of the centers of influence in that way. So I would go to bed at night and take some comfort in that. So let me answer your first and most important question, which is, I think that the disagreement vectors play in just as divisive a way amongst younger people as they do amongst older people. It might be a different set of disagreement vectors, but this is my issue with the way diversity and multiculturalism works on college campuses right now. And I am progressive, right? So I'll just say, but the assumption is it's a magic circle of progressive social attitudes. That's not diversity. Diversity is when people who have very different views on fundamental things are able to encounter one another with honesty about those views and to find other ways to work together. So my sense is you and your generational peers, cleave 55-45 or 40-60 on many of the great issues of the time, right? What I would encourage you to do is ask the question, honestly, what are the 5 most controversial issues, the 5 most divisive issues that I can think of with my generational peers? How would I be able to have a conversation with somebody who disagrees with me on this in a way that's civil, in a way that's not hiding your view and not expecting them to hide theirs, and also have a conversation in a way that doesn't get vortexed in that spot? Do you see what I'm saying? The ability to say, okay, this is a fundamental disagreement, right? I'm glad I understand your views. I'm glad you understand mine. I'm glad we've learned from each other in this. Let's not let this define our relationship. Let's not let our different views on where to draw the line in the Middle East define our relationship. let's make sure that if we're both surgeons, we can still operate on patients together. If we're part of the PTA, we can still go to meetings together and work with one another in that way. That's the genius of American civil society, is that people who are divided on a whole host of controversial issues agree to work together on other things. And I think that is not the case in many of these emerging democracies where people are saying, I can't be, forget in the same room, I can't be in the same city as you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Amber Lewis, and I'm from Utah Valley University. And my question is, I've seen a lot of, in looking at interfaith relations, one of the biggest problems seems to be fear. That's what keeps people from dialoguing and from interacting. And I'm wondering if you've seen anything that's really helped to reduce the fear or get people past that point to where they can work together.
Right. So, I mean, I think that this is where interfaith leaders come in, right? So I think two skills that interfaith leaders have are the ability to articulate a language around faith that people feel comfortable with, right? I don't think it's a watered-down language. It's not a lowest common denominator language. It's an inspiring, proactive, positive, comfortable language. The one that we use the most at Interfaith Youth Corps is service, right? So our kind of key question is, what inspires you from your tradition to serve others? So that, on the one hand, is a profound question if you think about it. All religious traditions command their people to serve other folks, but it's also a relatively innocuous question. So a big part of what interfaith leaders do is have the ability to introduce that language. A lot of the fear is people fearing that they're going to say something wrong, right? So part of what you have to do is introduce a language that people are comfortable with, that people can start to use themselves. And the second thing is closely related, which is creating spaces where that language is then freely used. And I mean, the obvious one is interfaith service projects. That's, so what we do at Interfaith Youth Corps is we train college students to be interfaith leaders in a civic sense. And the major part of the training is on how to organize an interfaith service project, right? Where you're bringing people who orient around religion differently together, who have very different views on fundamental things, everything from who's going to heaven to, whether gay marriage ought to be legal. But they agree on running a tutoring program for the school across the tracks. They agree on the importance of a river cleanup. They agree on the importance of a whole host of service type things, and they are excited about talking about those things. Right, so that language, the ability to advance that language and the ability to create that space, I think is very important.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Macy Byron. I'm also from BYU. You actually just answered my question. It was, what does Interfaith Youth Corps, do specifically? And I'd like to hear more about that. But I guess the other part of my question is what we can do in our communities and our universities to, help further that.
Yeah. So I mean, I love that Utah Valley's here. Is that Bonnie? Okay. Okay, gotcha. So I love that these other universities are here. So I think that the single most profound things that college students can do is organize interfaith service projects on their campuses, right? So bringing together people from the Hillel, the Newman Center, the LDS group, the Muslim Students Association, bringing them together for concrete service projects and creating a space where they can have a dialogue about what inspires them from their tradition to serve others. And that's what we train for at Interfaith Youth Corps. So if you go to our website, ifyc.org, and you go to, the students or leadership section, we have 4 interfaith leadership institutes a year. We just finished one in LA 2 weeks ago, where 120 students come together and they go through a 3.5-day training to learn how to run these interfaith service projects. Who's been to one of those in this room? Handful of folks? Okay, a couple of folks. Cool. So that's what we do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sir, thank you very much for taking time. Colin Mansfield.
Sir makes me feel even older. So just call me Ethan.
I'm from West Point, sir.
Yeah,
so
right. Thank you.
One of those things. My question actually relates to the military, but also just to leadership in general. I'm going to be commissioning in May. I'm going to be a second lieutenant in the Army. And there's a good chance I'm going to come into contact while I'm a platoon leader with folks of various backgrounds and religions. And so this concept of an interfaith leader is really interesting to me. It seems like it's walking the balance between somebody who thinks that they are 100% right about what they believe or perhaps unwilling to consider other options, and somebody who perhaps believes that everything is true. Somebody that can hold on to their convictions while still acknowledging and understanding the differences of other religions. My question is, that sort of teeter-totter and walking in the middle of that balance, when you've had to lead these groups of students at the youth corps and trying to transition them into being interfaith leaders, how do you balance that, and how do you teach them to walk that balance, and how can that maybe apply to me?
What a great question. Can I tell a quick military joke?
Go for it.
So,
as long as the Navy's at the butt.
That's right. The Navy is. Any midshipmen in this room, by the way? Any midshipmen here? Any naval academy? No? Doug. Oh, this is going to be fun. I spoke at the Naval Academy about 5 or 6 years. I'm not smart enough to get an invitation to West Point, but the Naval Academy will have me, right?
See what we can do, sir.
Yeah, thank you. So here's how I opened my talk in front of like 300 very stern-faced midshipmen. None of them as good-looking as you, young man, but very stern-faced, right? So I say, when I told my dad that I was invited to speak at the Naval Academy, he kind of squared his jaw and looked at me sternly. My dad's a Muslim immigrant from India, and he said, "You tell them we are different from those people, fundamentally different. We are fighting Irish fans." There's like this long-running, right? Doug gets this. This is like, long-running rivalry, right? And we're about to start one with the BYU, by the way. But I swear, this is like my introduction to military culture. There was like, when I said we are different, after I said my dad was a Muslim from India, right? We are different. I got like icy stares. I was like, and then once they realized that was a joke, they like turned to whoever the authority was in the room. He kind of nodded his head, and then they all laughed, right? So that was the intro for me. So a couple things about your question. So look, the reason I talked about a theology of interfaith cooperation, especially at a campus like BYU, is because my hope is that people are 100% convinced of their tradition. Right? I'm not a 99% Muslim. I'm 100% Muslim. Right? What does that mean? That means that La ilaha illallah, Muhammad abduhu rasulullah. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is a servant and messenger, and there's no prophet after Muhammad. Right? So as much as I respect the LDS tradition, and I might recognize Joseph Smith as a great teacher, I cannot recognize him as a prophet. I don't kind of believe that. I 100% believe that. Right? So my relationship with the LDS community is not based on a doctrinal agreement. Right? It's based on other forms of admiration. Family life in the LDS community, for example. Civic structures in the LDS community. And it's based on the pragmatic recognition that I live in a diverse society, and a diverse society is much better when it has bridges rather than barriers or bubbles, because barriers and bubbles create the space for bombs. Right? So being an interfaith leader is not about being 0% or 50% or 99%. You can be wherever you are on that spectrum, right? You can call yourself a searching Christian. You can call yourself an agnostic. You can call yourself a conservative Muslim or an Orthodox Jew or a conservative Mormon, right? The issue is, are you committed to building bridges between people who orient around religion differently? And do you disagree with them? Of course you do. That's table stakes, You disagree with them in profound areas, and you agree with them in profound areas. But you believe that it is an important, if not sacred, project to build that relationship, right? Because it comes from your tradition, hence the theology or ethic of interfaith cooperation, and because there's no other way to have a diverse democracy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Eboo. I'll call you Eboo.
Thank you.
I'm from BYU.
Yeah, nice.
So my name's Alex, and I just want to thank you for bringing up a term that we can unite around and a platform where we can discuss interfaith leadership and cooperation. And one question actually stems from this gentleman's question as well. I believe that our fundamental beliefs dictate or at least influence significantly our behavior. And my question is, when we're cooperating or working with people that have fundamentally different beliefs about major issues, how could we unite our behavior in addressing those major issues when our beliefs are so fundamentally
What a great question. So it's not going to be fully united, right? That's the deal. So, and nothing you do with anybody is fully united, right? You don't talk about all dimensions of your life with your grandmother.
fair?
Right? So, but especially in civil society, I think it was Schopenhauer who had the image of porcupines as civil society, right? And you know, the different porcupines representing different communities. And he says, you know, one night the porcupines, they decided they had to huddle together for warmth. And one night they woke up in the morning and there was blood everywhere. And their needles had pricked each other. They were too close. They tried to do too many things together. So the next night they got scared and they moved far apart. And in the morning they woke up and several porcupines had frozen to death. They were too far. Right? A civil society is a place where the porcupines are close enough to provide each other warmth, but not too close that they prick each other. Right? So, I mean, again, you can't have water without the wet. I have to admit, that's my new favorite metaphor. You are not going to be fully aligned or united with other people on everything. And that's just the deal. Right? That's just the deal.
Thank you very much.
I'm Chris from BYU Hawaii. I have a question. I just kind of want to know what you think about when there's conflict or when there's disagreements and religion isn't all. I feel like there's other needs and views that people have on the world that aren't centered around religion,
Right.
people's identity, their
Yeah.
meaning, and their security. What do you think about that when it's not just all about
Yeah.
their religious view?
No, I mean, that's a clear, so I think that's a really important point. So, you know, I would not have given the same speech if this was a conversation on racial diversity in American society. I'm not interested in overlaying a religion blanket on everything, but given that this is a conference on bridging religious divides, I led with that. Having said that, you know, the two other things I would that are perfectly consistent with your comment is one is the intersectionality of identities, and this is kind of a new kind of vogue topic, especially in academic circles, but how people's various identities intersect with each other. And the second is social context, right? So just because you're LDS doesn't mean you act the same in every single social context. The social context guides a range of different behaviors, right? I mean, the behavior that's appropriate for the football stadium is not the same behavior that's appropriate in a calculus class, right? But you're on the same campus and you're LDS both places, right? So this is not a panacea for everything. It is simply to say, as Doug put it 25 years ago in a book, religion is the missing dimension of statecraft, right? Dealing directly with religion is the missing dimension in many diversity conversations and in many conversations about building democratic societies. And I think our collective thesis is you have to deal with that proactively, and the kind of flourish that I'm advancing on that is that can't be dealt with in the abstract. You have to have a group of people who are committing themselves to that, just like you have a group of people who are committing themselves to human rights and environmentalism, feminism and social entrepreneurship, etc. If we're going to have a world where people who orient around religion differently are defined by bridges between their communities, we're going to have a critical mass of interfaith leaders. But it's not a solution to everything. Okay. So I have a quick idea. So why don't we, if you guys can make it quick, why don't each of you ask your question, like 20 seconds each, and I'll answer the easiest one.
Okay, well, I'm Kevin. Thank you again for coming. I'm from Brigham Young University here. And my question was, as an LDS organization, or I guess the LDS Church, we're a largely proselyting unit, and I'm sure you're aware of that. And
oh yeah.
So there's the interplay of there's probably many people who want to be interfaith leaders who would like to keep that barrier, but we reconcile the fact that while we're trying to say to others we are willing to work with you and respect you for who you are, at the same time, we're also trying to share those beliefs. And I think that's often
It's a great question.
the reason why we do it is misunderstood.
That is definitely not the easiest question,
Yeah.
but it's a great question. Let's keep moving and then.
So I want to ask the same question. Actually, no. My name is Jordan. I'm at Duke University. You came a few weeks ago, and it really inspired a lot of us to. We have had a lot more people get involved with interfaith work since then, and we were actually talking last week. We had a group discussion about why we do interfaith work, and kind of getting at what you were talking about, how everyone needs that, that personal doctrine on why they're doing it. And missionary work got brought up, and I was just curious to hear your thoughts on
Great.
how missionary work interacted.
The weather at Duke was terrible. Does the Mormon God know something that the Methodist God doesn't? Maybe.
My name is Bradley Anderson. I'm also at Brigham Young University. My question is fairly simplistic. What sorts of opposition have you faced in the spread of your rhetoric, and how have you dealt with that?
Yeah, great. None of these are easy questions, right?
My name is Lisa Hawkins. I'm from the University of Utah, and my question is, in a position of public governance, is it possible to foster an environment of equality for all religions in a diverse community without being purely secular?
All right. Yours better be easy.
My name is Allison from Utah State University. I apologize. My question is very similar to those that have already been expressed in this line. I wanted to ask, relating particularly to the first two and the question and discussion from the West Point question a few minutes ago, if you have interfaith leaders who are 100% committed, and in some faith traditions that does include a belief in proselyting or missionary work, how do you continue to build religious bridges around the complexity in a society where not every individual in question is 100% committed to a specific faith tradition?
That's a great. Okay, so these are all terrific questions. Yeah. President Samuelson's like, how are you going to deal with these? I have no idea. Let's see what the heck happens here. Okay, so here's, I guess, so let me answer your question first, right? So this political theorists have been struggling with this question for a very, very long time. And you actually happen to be coming of age in an era where it's particularly salient, right? Especially around gay marriage and the various issues that are the spokes off of that wheel. And the sense that is the state, if the state tilts in one way, is it discriminating against a particular group of people any way it tilts, right? So I have a view on this, but here's what I would say. I mean, I would take the rich opportunity of being a student right now and like start reading the political theory tradition from John Locke through John Courtney Murray through Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, through Michael Walzer, through Alfred Stepan, right? Like this is really, really rich stuff, and this is part of the fun of being at university. Take that theory and apply it in your own mind to the particular issues of the day. This is a great senior thesis opportunity, right? So I like the formulation by Alfred Stepan. It's called the twin tolerations, and it's a kind of a common formulation in dealing with religion and government, which is that government is required to provide, the state is required to provide a space for religious communities the free exercise of religious communities. And in return, religious communities don't dominate the state. What does it mean to provide open space, free space? And what does it mean to not dominate the state? Right? So these are big questions and very important questions. So let me answer the question about the various types of people involved in interfaith work. So remember, we're dealing with diversity as it is. We are not like cherry picking the ideal. It's not like you're not drafting a basketball team of interfaith players, right? You're dealing with diversity as it is. America in all of its 320 million people diverse glory. Right? So you're dealing with a bunch of people who aren't quite sure about their religion, and you're dealing with a huge swath of people right? Let's do the numbers. About 25% of America is Catholic. Between 25% and 33% is evangelical. In both Catholicism and evangelical Christianity, proselytizing would be part of the tradition. Now, some communities would emphasize it more than other communities. But right there, part of the 50% of the population, this isn't, how many LDS in America? 8 million, 10 million? Okay, so clearly proselytizing is a core part of the LDS tradition. It's a core part of Islam. It's called dawah, right? So right there, you've got, some 140 million of your fellow citizens for whom it is an article of faith in some way, shape, or form to proselytize. Are you going to write those 140 million people outside of the circle of interfaith cooperation? No. You're going to create a circle that can accommodate that, right? And I think here's how you do it. You say, we recognize that people walk into this interfaith service project or this dialogue with a variety of faith commitments. Because we deal with religion as it is, we respect those commitments. But the basic ground rules for this space are these. So, no proselytizing here. Right? And that's just like and there might be a group of people who are like, hey, we don't even want people who proselytize out there to be in here because it makes us feel uncomfortable. And there's a group of people who proselytize who say, you're violating my free speech by saying that I can't proselytize. And guess what? In a diverse democracy, nobody gets everything they want. And I mean that very seriously. Nobody gets everything they want, right? So when you're bringing a variety of people together from diverse backgrounds into a space in which the disagreements are going to be recognized and commonality is going to be lifted up and made inspiring, part of the ground rule is people with a range of commitments can enter. I mean, are there people outside the circle? Yeah, I think the KKK is outside the circle. But if you're like, well, if you happen to be pro-life, right? And you say, well, look, I just can't be in a circle with pro-choice people. Well, there's 50% of the country, right? If you are anti-gay marriage, and you're like, I just can't be in a circle with pro-gay marriage people, well, that's 45% of the country. As soon as the circle you draw starts drawing off like, a significant part of the population, you're just not dealing with the diversity of the democracy. So the issue is, how does the interfaith leader establish a set of ground rules and a space that people feel comfortable in, right? And then how do you guide a conversation and shape a set of projects that recognize diversity and difference and disagreement, and at the same time lift up and make inspiring commonality? That's why the Ruth Messenger story is so powerful, because that's what she was able to do around foster families in western Oklahoma. How do you feel as an LDS person or an evangelical or a Muslim or a Catholic for whom proselytizing is an article of faith? I'll tell a quick story. So my friend Scott Alexander runs the Catholic Muslim Studies program at Catholic Theological University, largest Catholic seminary in the United States, trains a bunch of priests. And every year he meets with the Archbishop of Chicago, now a cardinal, right, Cardinal George. And the first question the cardinal always asks, Cardinal George, he says, Professor Alexander, you do believe it is a holy activity for the church to seek to convert Muslims? And Scott responds, yes. And then the next 59 minutes and 30 seconds of their conversation is about the interfaith service and dialogue programs that Scott is organizing. What did Walt Whitman say? I am vast, I contain multitudes. Religious traditions are vast. Dimensions of those traditions proselytize. Dimensions of them seek dialogue. Dimensions of them seek to serve others. In an interfaith space, you are emphasizing the dimensions of dialogue and service. You are recognizing that proselytizing is an important part of your religion. You are just saying it's not everything. And there are people that say to me, yes, it is everything. And I say, when you are in an accounting class, the answer to every question is not Jesus Christ, right? It's just not everything. You are able to, I promise you, functionally, you are able to do other things than proselytize. So, I am simply saying, when you are working with people from different religions and the explicit situation is not proselytizing, enter in dialogue or enter in service. I think the key thing here is being clear what you're about, because I do think a danger in this work is what I call the Trojan horse, right? But I think that LDS, Catholics, evangelicals, people who are global and have been doing this for a while are actually very, very good at this, is basically building a firewall between their proselytizing activities and, say, their disaster relief activities or their interfaith activities, et cetera. When I've been in interfaith spaces with LDS folks, for example, for 15 years, never felt proselytized to. Right, so I think it's about creating that space, and I think, for people who are part of those traditions, it's about recognizing now I'm emphasizing the service part of Catholicism, and in a different space I might emphasize the proselytizing part. I'm going to leave you with a piece of a poem, okay, and then you all go to bed, and I'm going to go to bed too. So William Stafford's A Ritual to Read to Each Other, right? I want to get back to the holiness of this work and the times in which we live. First and last stanza. If you don't take the time to get to know me, and I don't take the time to get to know you, then a pattern that others made may prevail in this world, and following the wrong God home, we could miss our star. Those who are awake must be awake now, or else a falling line may lull us back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no, or maybe, must be clear now. The darkness around us is deep. Jazakallah, may God give you goodness. Thank you.